world stopped when the news came. It wasn't just another celebrity passing or a sports figure we'd seen in the headlines once in a while. No, this was different. This was the death of a legend, one of the greatest athletes to ever walk the earth. Muhammad Ali wasn't just a boxer. He was an icon, a symbol of defiance, a voice for the oppressed, and a man who redefined what it meant to be great. When he died, it wasn't just the end of a life, it felt like the end of an era. The man who once danced like a butterfly and stung like a bee had finally been silenced by the hands of time, but his legacy, oh, his legacy still echoed across the world. How did we get here? How did the fighter, the poet, the philanthropist, the activist who so fiercely graced the ring, spoke his mind, and took on the establishment eventually succumb to the effects of time, illness, and the weight of his own battles? How did the world's most famous boxer, the one who stood up for what he believed in, even when it cost him his career, his health, and his reputation, end up facing the hardest fight of all, the fight for his life? It wasn't supposed to be this way. He had defied the odds so many times before, from his early years, when he took on opponents far bigger and stronger than himself, to the legendary fights that kept the world on edge, wondering who would emerge victorious. Ali was a man who thrived on challenges. His audacity, his confidence, and his unique brand of charisma made him a legend. But the fight he would eventually lose, the one he couldn't win, no matter how much heart he had, was a different kind of battle, one fought not in the ring, but against his own body. For years, Ali had been fighting a disease that no one truly understood: Parkinson's disease. It wasn't just the medical community that was unaware of how to treat him, but the world itself seemed unable to grasp the depths of his suffering. To many, he had become a symbol of resilience. But was there a point where that resilience could no longer save him? Could the man who had once stood tall, facing off against the best of the best in the ring, ever truly defeat a foe that he couldn't punch, outsmart, or talk his way out of? As the years passed, Ali's condition worsened. His iconic voice, once so sharp and brash, began to tremble. His body, which had been so nimble, so full of energy, now betrayed him in ways that seemed cruel. But even in his decline, even in the midst of losing the very thing that had made him a legend, Muhammad Ali remained a fighter. He fought for his dignity, fought for his family, and fought for the memory of the man he once was. But as the disease ravaged his body, the world watched helpless. The man who had once made his opponents tremble with fear now faced an opponent that would not flinch, an opponent that would not give in. But this wasn't just about the loss of a physical battle, it was about the loss of a cultural giant, someone whose impact stretched far beyond boxing. Ali had been more than just a boxer. He had been a voice for civil rights, a beacon of hope for the oppressed, and a testament to the power of self-belief. His death wasn't just the death of a man, it was the death of an entire generation's idol. So many people looked up to him, saw in him something bigger than the sport of boxing. His struggles, his triumphs, his bold statements, these weren't just about punches thrown in a ring. They were about pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be human, to stand up for yourself, to make a difference. As the news spread that Ali had passed away, there was an outpouring of grief from across the globe. Fans, celebrities, politicians, people from every walk of life, from every corner of the world mourned. The headlines were filled with tributes, stories, and memories of the boxer who had fought not only in the ring but for justice, for peace, and for the future. His legacy, they said, would live on forever. But what about the man behind the legend? What had it really been like for Ali as his health declined? Was it possible that even someone as strong and defiant as him could feel defeated by something so insidious? And how did the world truly come to terms with the death of such a towering figure? In this story, we're going to dive deep into the final chapter of Muhammad Ali's life, not just the last few years, but the long journey he took from the height of his fame to the days when his mind and body betrayed him. This wasn't just the story of a boxer, but the story of a man who had lived through a tumultuous world, fought battles beyond the ring, and somehow made it out alive, only to face an enemy that no one could prepare him for. From the glory days when he was at the top of the world to the slow decline that left his fans heartbroken, we'll explore what it really meant to be Muhammad Ali, both as a fighter and as a human being. His last years were filled with more than just physical pain. They were filled with a kind of quiet resilience that few could ever truly understand. But in the end, no matter how hard he fought, there was one opponent who could never be knocked out: time. How did Muhammad Ali face the final fight of his life? And what lessons can we learn from his struggle, his triumphs, and his legacy? These are the questions that lingered after his death, questions that people still ponder to this day. Ali was more than just a man. He was a movement, a philosophy, a challenge to everything we thought we knew about the world and about ourselves. But as the final bell rang and the world mourned his loss, it left us with a question that remains unanswered. What happens when the greatest of all time faces the greatest challenge of all? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The journey of Muhammad Ali doesn't end with his death. It continues through the lessons he left behind, the memories he created, and the legacy he built one punch at a time. Muhammad Ali's story began long before his battle with Parkinson's disease. His legacy was built on the sweat and grit he poured into his craft, his loud, unapologetic personality, and the way he turned the world's expectations upside down. The man born Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. in Louisville, Kentucky, didn't just change boxing. He reshaped what it meant to be a public figure in America, especially for a black man in the 1960s. His brash confidence and undeniable skill in the ring made him the most famous fighter in history. But it was his defiance outside the ring that cemented his place as an icon. Growing up in the segregated South, Ali was no stranger to racism and discrimination. But from a young age, he showed a determination to prove everyone wrong. When he was just 12 years old, someone stole his bicycle. Ali, angry and wanting revenge, told a police officer that he was going to whoop the thief, but the officer, in a moment that would shape Ali's life, suggested he learn how to box before taking matters into his own hands. Ali took that advice to heart, and within a year, he was in the gym training hard and fast, already dreaming of becoming a champion. He was no ordinary boxer. From the start, Ali's combination of speed, agility, and unshakable confidence was a rare sight in the sport. He would float like a butterfly and sting like a bee, a phrase he coined himself, but also a philosophy he lived by. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to entertain, to talk smack, to break the mold, and set himself apart from everyone else in the sport. Ali wasn't afraid of anyone. He had no fear, not of other boxers, not of the media, not of the public's judgment. And that attitude made him both beloved and controversial in equal measure. When he won the World Heavyweight Championship in 1964 by defeating Sonny Liston, the world took notice. But it was Ali's declaration that he had been the greatest of all time that made headlines. People were drawn to him, his charisma, his flair for drama, and, of course, his undeniable talent. He was a man who commanded attention, whether in the ring or outside of it. He wasn't just fighting for a title, he was fighting for something bigger. He was fighting to be heard, to challenge the status quo, and to demand respect from a world that didn't always want to give it. But his most controversial move came just a few years later. When the U.S. entered the Vietnam War, Ali, who had converted to Islam and changed his name, refused to be drafted. He famously declared, "I ain't got no quarrel with the Viet Cong," a statement that shocked the nation and turned him into an enemy in the eyes of many. Ali's refusal to fight in a war he didn't believe in cost him his boxing titles, his livelihood, and his place in the world of sports. He was banned from boxing for several years, a move that many saw as a political statement, but for Ali, it was a matter of conscience. His decision sparked a national debate about patriotism, race, and the role of athletes in politics. And though he would eventually be reinstated and return to the ring, the damage had been done. Ali's relationship with the public would never be the same. As his career continued, Ali became an even more formidable force in boxing. He fought and beat some of the best the sport had ever seen: Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Ken Norton. His trilogy with Frazier, especially the fight of the century in 1971, defined his career, and his victory over Foreman in the Rumble in the Jungle in 1974 solidified his status as an all-time great. He was the face of boxing, the embodiment of resilience, defiance, and skill. Ali's ability to take on the biggest challenges and emerge victorious made him a legend not only in sports, but in popular culture. But while he was dazzling the world with his athleticism and larger-than-life persona, his body was beginning to take a toll. With each fight, Ali was enduring more and more punishment. His style of standing toe-to-toe with his opponents, absorbing heavy punches in exchange for his own devastating blows, was effective, but it wasn't kind to his health. The rope-a-dope strategy he used in the Foreman fight may have been genius in the moment, but it came with a price. Ali's head took a lot of damage over the years, and with that damage came the inevitable consequences. In his later years, as he tried to remain relevant in the sport he loved, his health began to decline, and the signs of Parkinson's disease began to emerge. Parkinson's disease is a neurodegenerative disorder that causes tremors, rigidity, and slow movement. For someone like Ali, a man whose entire career was built on speed and movement, the disease must have felt like a cruel, ironic twist of fate. The man who had once been the fastest fighter in the world was now struggling to move, to speak, to live the way he had once done so effortlessly. It was heartbreaking to watch, for his fans and for those who had known him as a fearless fighter, a man who had never backed down from a challenge. In the years after his diagnosis, Ali's life took a different turn. He became an ambassador for the disease, using his fame to raise awareness and funds for Parkinson's research. But there were days when even his unshakable spirit couldn't mask the suffering he was experiencing. His public appearances became more rare, and the man who had once been the center of attention seemed to fade from the spotlight. Despite this, Ali continued to be active in his own way. He traveled, met with world leaders, and worked to inspire people. But the fight against Parkinson's was a battle he couldn't win, and no amount of willpower could change that. Then, in 2016, came the day the world had been dreading. Muhammad Ali, the man who had been both a champion and a revolutionary, passed away. The news broke like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves across the globe. Ali had been in and out of the hospital in the months leading up to his death, battling respiratory issues, in addition to the ongoing effects of Parkinson's. But his passing still felt sudden, a reminder of the fragility of life. It felt like we had lost something far greater than a famous boxer. We had lost a piece of history. The tributes came pouring in. Athletes, politicians, and celebrities from around the world shared their memories of Ali, of how he had inspired them, challenged them, and changed their lives. But for many, especially those who had grown up watching him in the ring, it was a more personal loss. Ali had been a figure who transcended the sport of boxing. He had been a voice for those who had none, a fighter who never gave up, even when it seemed like the world was against him. His passing marked the end of an era, and for many, it was hard to imagine the world without him. Yet, even in his death, Ali's influence lived on. His impact on the world of boxing, on civil rights, on politics, on the very fabric of society, was undeniable. He had fought not just for victory in the ring, but for a better world, for the voiceless, for the marginalized. His death may have closed the final chapter of his life, but his story, his message, and his spirit would endure. And now, As the world reflects on his life and legacy, the question remains, what does it truly mean to be Muhammad Ali? To live with such passion, to fight with such determination, and to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. For those who knew him, for those who admired him from afar, and for those who were inspired by his unwavering courage, Ali's death was not the end. It was a reminder of the power of one man's ability to change the world. So, as we look back on the life of Muhammad Ali, the greatest of all time, we must also look forward, remembering that his legacy is not just in the championships he won or the opponents he defeated, but in the lives he touched and the battles he fought beyond the ring. The loss of Muhammad Ali is still felt today, but his story, his spirit, and his fight will continue to inspire generations to come. As the world mourned the loss of Muhammad Ali, something deeper stirred beneath the surface of the tributes and accolades. Ali's passing wasn't just a moment of silence for a boxer, it was the end of an era. Yes, but it also felt like a powerful force had left the world. Those who had admired him, watched him rise from a young, brash fighter to an icon, couldn't quite shake the feeling that something important was missing. How could the world keep moving forward when a figure like him had been so ingrained in every part of it? It wasn't just the loss of his personality that lingered. It was the loss of a man who had once seemed to defy time and space. The man who once floated like a butterfly and stung like a bee could now barely lift his arms to speak. That painful, silent battle against Parkinson's had been an internal war that none could truly witness in full. The very disease that robbed him of his strength had almost become a metaphor for the world's decline, a symbol of how things could slip away quietly, even when we didn't want them to. As his health worsened, Ali had been increasingly absent from the limelight, retreating into a quieter existence. The constant media frenzy had once been his fuel. The microphones, the cameras, the crowds, they all fed into his enormous confidence. But now, in his final years, there were fewer public appearances, fewer moments to rally the public around him. It wasn't just his physical health that was affected, it was his essence, his presence, his ability to command a room and shape the world around him. In those final months, some began to wonder, what happens to the world when a man so crucial to it, so full of life, begins to fade? But there was something else at play. For years, Ali had been more than just a fighter. He had been a symbol of defiance, of hope, of perseverance. His refusal to fight in Vietnam, his rise from the depths of controversy, his change of name and religion, all of it had been part of a greater narrative. He wasn't just in it for the victories, he had taken on battles that were larger than boxing itself. And with his passing, a strange emptiness seemed to seep in, particularly for those who had followed his every move, not just for his athletic ability, but for his ability to challenge the norms of society. Many felt like Ali had been fighting for something even more important than the championship belts he'd won. He had been fighting for freedom, for individual rights, for the dignity of every person. The world now had to reckon with the fact that there would never be another like him. His battles outside the ring had been as significant as the ones inside it, and perhaps even more meaningful. In his final years, there were a few who felt the need to take up his mantle, those who were inspired by the courage he showed in the face of such adversity. But they were also confronted with a harsh truth. How could they, or anyone, match the power of a man who had been so audacious, so unapologetic, so larger than life? The questions of legacy were everywhere, hanging in the air like an unanswered prayer. One young fighter, in particular, stood out. He had watched Ali's fights on television, reading every biography, listening to every speech. He was determined to make his mark, to prove that the same fire that burned in Ali's chest still existed. But it wasn't easy. The world had changed so much since Ali's prime. No longer was the political climate the same. There was a sense of nostalgia for a simpler time, when athletes like Ali stood for something bigger than the sport they participated in. But how could a new generation of athletes possibly carry that same weight? It wasn't just the younger generation who felt Ali's absence. There were those who had known him personally, the trainers, the cornermen, the friends who had spent decades alongside him. They too had seen the changes in him, watched as Parkinson's slowly took away the very parts of him that made him invincible in the ring. The fighter was no longer there. What remained was a man whose spirit, though still fierce, was frail in ways that were difficult to accept. Behind the scenes, however, there was also a great deal of quiet reflection. People who had worked with Ali over the years, from promoters to managers, all knew how much he had been willing to sacrifice for the sport and for the causes he believed in. Yet, as the world moved forward, it became clear that Ali's death wasn't simply the loss of a person, it was the end of an idea. The world no longer seemed to have room for someone who stood so firmly on their principles, someone who was willing to lose everything for a cause. For the people who were close to him, it felt like they had lost more than just a friend or a mentor. They had lost a part of themselves. The world felt smaller without him in it, even though he had been largely silent for years. He had been the guiding star for so many, an example of what it meant to fight, not just in sports, but for justice, for equality, for humanity. How could the world keep going without someone like Ali, who had fought so fiercely and unapologetically for so long? But what if, deep down, the people who had been closest to him knew something that no one else did? What if, in the quiet moments, Ali had made peace with his fate? What if he had already passed on his wisdom to those around him, imparted his final lessons, and made it clear that the fight wasn't over for anyone who had been touched by his life? The problem was, no one was sure. Everyone had their own version of Ali's story. The man had become a myth, a larger-than-life figure whose flaws had been hidden from the public eye. The truth, however, was buried deep within the layers of Ali's life. There were stories that no one had ever told about his personal struggles, the times when he wasn't the greatest, when he was simply human. Some of those closest to him had kept these stories locked away, unwilling to share them with the public. They were the intimate moments, the conversations, the lessons, the quiet gestures of kindness that had shaped him as a person. Perhaps it was because, in those final years, Ali had become more human than ever before. Yet there remained a lingering question that no one could answer. Had Ali's fight been truly over? The world had witnessed his decline, had seen the toll that the disease had taken on him, but was that the end of the story? The legend of Muhammad Ali had always been one of resilience and reinvention. Even in his final moments, there were those who believed that there was more to be discovered. Perhaps, just perhaps, Ali's final lesson was that there was no final lesson, that even in death, his story was not finished. As the world continued to grieve, a surprising revelation began to emerge from the shadows. It started subtly, with whispers circulating amongst those who'd been closest to Muhammad Ali. A few statements, a few cryptic remarks made in private, began to paint a different picture of the man the world had lost. Slowly, the veil started to lift, and a startling truth began to surface. In the months leading up to Ali's death, there had been an ongoing conversation among a select group of people, close friends, family, and confidants. What had been kept under wraps was now inching closer to the light. Ali had been working on something in his final years. It wasn't a book, a speech, or a grand revelation about his life. It was something far more intimate, something personal, and yet ultimately far more profound. The world had thought it had seen the final chapter of his story. After all, the outpouring of tributes had been monumental. Politicians, world leaders, fellow athletes, and celebrities all weighed in, speaking of the impact of his life. The media had created a narrative, a man who had fought against injustice, who had battled illness with grace, who had transcended the sport of boxing. But that was just the story on the surface. Deep down, Ali had been preparing something more. It was only after his passing that those closest to him began to realize what Ali had been doing during those last years. He hadn't merely been fighting to live, he had been orchestrating something else entirely. A message, a final gift for the world that would outlast even his greatest achievements. In his silence, in his retreat from the limelight, Ali had been putting together a framework. It wasn't a grand speech or a final stand. It was something simpler, something quieter, but infinitely more powerful. He had been passing on his philosophy to the next generation in a way that no one had expected. At the core of this revelation was a project that few knew about, a series of one-on-one sessions he had conducted with young fighters, leaders, and thinkers in his final years. These were private moments, off the record, where Ali would speak not about boxing, but about life. About the importance of understanding who you are, about standing up, not just in the ring, but in your everyday life. His words, though soft and measured in those final months, were just as impactful as any punch he had ever thrown.
But there was a catch. Those who had been part of these sessions, fighters, activists, and close friends, were now being thrust into the spotlight, forced to share the wisdom Ali had imparted on them. And they weren't sure how to process it. Some had kept quiet out of respect, others because they hadn't fully understood the gravity of what had been said until now. But as time passed, and the world continued to mourn, the urgency to release these teachings became clearer. The climax of this story came unexpectedly when one of Ali's most trusted proteges, someone who had spent years working closely with him, stepped forward with a recording. It wasn't a recording of a speech, nor an interview. It was something far more private, Ali speaking directly to the world, in his own words. It was a final message, recorded in the quiet of his home, perhaps not fully understood by Ali himself at the time, but now, undeniably, a call to action. In this recording, Ali spoke plainly, directly, and with the same fire that had made him a global icon. He didn't speak of victories or losses in the ring. Instead, he spoke about humanity, about the fight against complacency, about the need for everyone, not just the famous, to take a stand. He had known his time was limited, but he had made sure that his voice, his philosophy, would live on long after his body had stopped moving. His words were an invitation not to follow him, but to follow what he stood for. To fight for truth, for justice, for the dignity of others. The world had expected his final act to be some grandiose gesture, a final fight, a farewell in the ring, or a grand speech delivered to a packed arena. But what Ali had left behind was far more subtle, far more enduring. The true climax of the story wasn't a moment of defiance or a final battle, it was the quiet realization that Ali's legacy was not tied to the victories or the titles he had amassed. It was in the quiet moments of reflection, the thoughtful conversations, and the words he had shared with those who would carry his torch forward. Yet, just when it seemed like the story had reached its emotional peak, an unexpected twist threw everything into disarray. The recording, initially thought to be an intimate, private moment, was not the only message Ali had left behind. The shocking revelation came when it was discovered that Ali had been in contact with a group of young activists from across the world, organizing a movement for change that would take his philosophy and turn it into action. A movement that had begun in the shadows, outside the public's gaze, and was now ready to step into the light. This wasn't a movement about boxing, and it wasn't even about sports. It was about something far greater. Ali had been sowing the seeds for a global shift, one that would challenge the status quo, promote equality, and fight for justice on every front. The world had thought it knew Muhammad Ali, but it was only now, after his death, that people were beginning to realize how deep his influence had truly gone. What seemed like the end of an era was actually the beginning of something new. In the final moments of the story, as the world grappled with this new information, the implications of Ali's final act were still unclear. What had he truly left behind? Was it just a collection of inspirational words, or was it something that could change the world? The twist was undeniable. Ali had never truly left. He had fought until the very end, but the fight was never about him. It was about the world he envisioned, one where each individual had the power to stand up for what was right, regardless of the odds. And now, with his death, his legacy was being carried forward by those who had once followed him, those who now understood that his fight had never been about winning a championship. It was about something far greater, the fight for the future of humanity. The revelation of Ali's secret movements and his final acts of quiet defiance rippled through the world, and the magnitude of his plan was soon impossible to ignore. What initially appeared as a tribute to his character, just a final message, was now a catalyst for something far greater than any of his fights or triumphs in the ring. It was an unspoken challenge to the world, a challenge to recognize that his legacy was never solely about the gloves, the titles, or even the fame. Muhammad Ali's final act was a masterstroke of true leadership. He had sowed the seeds of change not just through his words but through his actions, making sure that those who took up his mantle would have the tools, the resolve, and the backing to carry the fight forward. As the news spread about his involvement with young activists and leaders from all corners of the world, people began to realize that the message he had left behind wasn't just a message of hope. It was a blueprint for action. Ali had never been one to merely speak about change, he had embodied it. And now, even in death, he was pushing the world forward, asking people everywhere to challenge the status quo, to confront complacency, and to fight for a better future. This was no longer about honoring a legend, it was about creating a legacy, a movement that would extend far beyond the confines of his own life. The young activists who had once been students of Ali's philosophy, who had listened to his final words in private, now found themselves at the forefront of this movement. They weren't just carrying on his message, they were realizing it, turning his ideals into tangible action. It wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be an uphill battle, one that involved rethinking society's norms, disrupting power structures, and encouraging others to stand up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. But in their hearts, they knew they were not alone. Ali's spirit, his resilience, and his unyielding commitment to justice were now their guiding forces. The media had been abuzz with the details of the young leader's newfound mission, but it wasn't just the activists that had been impacted. Everyday people, individuals who had grown up hearing about Ali's victories, his courage, and his determination, found themselves rediscovering a new sense of purpose. The old champion, now gone, had ignited something in them, a fire that had been burning quietly in the background but was now being fanned into a roaring flame. It didn't matter what your background was, where you came from, or what you believed, Ali's message had become universal. It was about standing for justice, fighting for equality, and rejecting the idea that anything was impossible. The movement, though still in its infancy, began to take shape. Communities from every corner of the globe started to find common ground, rallying behind the idea that they could make a difference just like Ali had. The message of unity spread like wildfire, fueled by the knowledge that Ali's teachings had never been about dividing people into categories. They weren't about race or nationality or religion, they were about people, humans, standing up for each other, recognizing each other's shared humanity, and doing the right thing. Ali's influence was felt everywhere. His words, his actions, and his death had all catalyzed a global shift. But as the movement gained momentum, the leaders who had been closest to him began to feel the weight of their responsibility. It wasn't just about carrying forward Ali's message, it was about living up to the legacy he had left behind. They faced criticism, doubt, and even opposition, but each challenge only made them more determined to see his vision realized. They knew that this wasn't something that could be achieved overnight, but they also knew they couldn't give up, not after everything that Ali had endured and accomplished in his life. In the months and years following his death, the world saw the beginning of a new kind of activism, one that was grounded not in protest for protest's sake, but in real, actionable steps toward creating a better, more just world. There were tangible changes in the way people engaged with politics, education, social issues, and the economy. Inspired by Ali's spirit of resilience, people began to demand more from their leaders, from their communities, and from themselves. Yet, even as the world began to shift, there were still those who questioned whether it was truly possible to change the deep-rooted structures of power and influence. Some argued that it was an impossible fight, that no amount of activism could ever lead to real change. But those who had taken up Ali's mantle refused to be deterred. They continued to push forward, with Ali's voice echoing in their minds, his belief in the power of the individual driving them every day. For them, the fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. Through all of this, the memory of Muhammad Ali continued to resonate deeply with people everywhere. His iconic quotes, his unmatched courage, and his unwavering stance on the issues that mattered most were constantly invoked by the new generation of leaders. His life, his work, and his final message were now all part of the shared history of humanity, a testament to the power of one individual to change the world. But there was still more to the story. As the movement spread, the seeds that Ali had planted began to bear fruit in unexpected ways. Around the world, people were rising up, not in anger, but in hope. They were rejecting the limitations that had been placed upon them by society, and they were demanding that their voices be heard. The struggle for justice, equality, and human dignity was not over, it was ongoing, and every person who joined the movement was now part of the legacy that Ali had left behind. And then, one final twist unfolded. It was revealed that Ali's final act had not just been a fight for justice on behalf of the downtrodden or those who had been left behind. His final act had also been a plea for humanity to confront the biggest challenge it faced, the challenge of unity. Ali had seen the division, the hatred, and the fear that had plagued the world for so long. He had witnessed the erosion of empathy, the breakdown of understanding between cultures, and the rise of intolerance. But he had also seen the potential for change. He had believed, until the very end, that humanity could rise above its differences, that it could find common ground and come together to create a better world. Ali's death wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of something greater, a movement that would continue to evolve, adapt, and inspire people long into the future. His legacy wasn't just in the ring, in the championships, or in the records he set. His legacy was in the people who had been touched by his life and his words. And as long as they continued to carry his message forward, his spirit would never fade. It would live on in every fight for justice, in every act of compassion, and in every moment where humanity rose above its limitations to reach for something better. The world had said goodbye to Ali, but his influence would never truly fade. It would echo through the generations, a reminder that one person's determination, one person's courage, and one person's belief in something greater than themselves could change the course of history. The fight, Ali had shown us, was never truly over, it was just beginning.